Fixing and subassembly of cylinder block tools used for fixing and subassembly of cylinder block, rollover stand, steel square with aluminum handle, feeler gauge, internal dial indicator kit. Fix the cylinder block onto the rollover stand. Clean all sealing and mounting cottons of cylinder block, wipe them clean with non-woven fabrics. Check the cylinder block for crack, corrosion and burr, ensure the cylinder block is not damaged. Clean the engine oil and coolant passages and dry them with compressed air. Check cylinder plainness with feeler gauge and ruler. The difference between front end and rear end and that between left end and right end should not exceed 0.075 mm respectively. Within 50 mm radius, the difference does not exceed 0.01 mm. If the plainness of cylinder block does not meet the above technical specifications, replace the cylinder block. Use internal dial indicator to measure at the top and bottom of the piston area, totally 4 positions at 90 degrees, the cylinder bore separately. Cylinder bore diameter should be within 93.99 to 94.01 mm. The out of roundness should not exceed 0.01 mm. The taper should not exceed 0.01 mm. Remove the main bearing covers and put them aside orderly according to their marks. Installation of piston cooling nozzle. Tools for installation of piston cooling nozzle. Torque wrench. Clean and check piston cooling nozzle. Ensure that nozzle is not clogged, deformed or oil stained. Install nozzle. Ensure nozzle dowel pin is seated correctly and tighten bolts to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Then, check if any oil cooling nozzle is forgotten to be installed. Installation of crankshaft. Tools for installation of crankshaft. Oil drip. Wipe the upper shell housing of spindle with non-woven fabrics. The shell surface and back should be free of any scratch or burr. The original positioning of the shell should be marked during removal to facilitate reinstallation. Both ends of the shell shaft and the shell base should be flush respectively. The locating boss of upper shell should sit in the positioning groove of the shell base. The oil hole of upper shell should be aligned with that on shell housing. The shell surface should be coated with clean engine oil. Note that the fourth shaft seat and shell bag shall not be oiled. Wipe the crankshaft mounting surface with non-woven fabrics. Check the crankshaft appearance for impact or scratch or for blister or rust. Clean all oil passages of crankshaft and dry them with compressed air. Crankshaft hoisting. Mount the crankshaft onto the cylinder block with its small head at the front of cylinder block. Handle gently to avoid impact. Each shaft journal of crankshaft should be coated with clean engine oil for lubrication. Wipe the thrust bearing shell with non-woven fabrics and lubricate it with clean engine oil before installing it to the fourth bearing shell base. Rotate the crankshaft slightly until the clearance at one end of bearing shell cover is similar to that at the other end. Put in the thrust bearing shell. With one hand facing the operator, rotate the crankshaft while, along the crankshaft rotating direction, push the shell into its base. Note that the upper locating boss of thrust bearing shell should sit in the positioning groove of the shell base. Check if both ends of all shells are flush respectively. Installation of main bearing. Tools for installation of main bearing. Oil drip, torque wrench, dial indicator with magnetic base, bracket, shockproof rubber hammer, dial indicator. Wipe the lower shell and cover of main bearing with non-woven fabrics. Carefully check if there is any impact, scratch or impurity. If the used bearing shell is to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during disassembly. Installation of lower shell of main bearing. Ensure that the lower shell is seated correctly in the positioning groove and the bearing shell is flush with the shell base on both ends. The shell surface should be lubricated with detergent oil before mounting onto main bearing cover. Ensure that the annular dowel pin on the main bearing cover is positioned correctly. In addition, Note that the locking dogs and numbers on the main bearing cover should match the shell base position and direction respectively. Use a rubber hammer to gently tap the bearing cover until it fits closely with the bearing seat. Lubricate the main bearing cover bolts with clean engine oil, install them into the threaded sections, and tighten them crosswise from the center to both sides. Technical specifications. First, tighten the bolts to 50 nanometers, next torque to 80 nanometers, and finally rotate them by 90 degrees. Note that while tightening the main bearing bolts to final torque, check frequently if the crankshaft rotates freely. Fix the magnetic base onto the flat surface of cylinder block, then press the dial indicator against the front end of the crankshaft and fix it at the smooth surface. Finally, move the crankshaft longitudinally and smoothly. The maximum difference among dial indicator readings is the axial clearance. The axial clearance should be within 0.023 to 0.365 mm. Installation of front gear chamber. Tools used for installation of front gear chamber. Torque wrench. Clean and check front end face of the cylinder block. Mount the new gasket onto front gear chamber. Check the components of front gear chamber for scratches, cracks, and abrasion. Install the front gear chamber cover. Install bolts and tighten them as shown to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of crankshaft front seal. Tools for installation of crankshaft front seal. Special tools for crankshaft front seal, rubber hammer. Clean and check oil seal hole. Use the duct of new oil seal to locate the new seal onto the front end of crankshaft. Then use special tools to press the oil seal into the front chamber cover at a constant speed until the correct depth is reached. Note: it is prohibited to apply oil to the oil seal. Subassembly of piston and connecting rod. Tools for subassembly of piston and connecting rod. Oil drip, piston expander. Clean piston ring and piston with non-woven fabrics. Check if they are clean without any burr. Firstly, install two-piece oil control ring with expansion ring opening at 180 degrees from the oil control ring opening. Secondly, install the black gas ring. Finally, install silver-white gas ring. Note that while installing the top two gas rings, the top mark should face the piston top. The piston pin hole, and connecting rod pin hole should be coated with a layer of clean oil. If the used piston pin as well as connecting rod and its bearing shell are to be reinstalled, proper marks should be made during this assembly. The removed parts must be restored. Assembly of piston and connecting rod. Note: ensure the bosses of both connecting rod and its cover are at the same side as the notch of piston skirt. Install the new piston pin circlip. Check if the piston pin rotates smoothly. Wipe the upper and lower shells of connecting rod with non-woven fabrics. The deep red shell should be at the top of connecting rod. The silver shell should be at the bottom of connecting rod. Check if there is any impact, scratch or burr. Install the connecting rod bearing shell. Ensure the shell sits correctly in the positioning groove, and the bearing shell is flush with the shell base at both ends. Lubricate the connecting rod bearing shell surface with detergent oil. Note that the shell back should not be oiled. Installation of piston and connecting rod assembly. Tools for installation of piston and connecting rod assembly. Oil drip, torque wrench, feeler gauge, dial indicator, shockproof rubber hammer, piston ring compressor. Lubricate the inner surface of bore with clean oil. Mount the guide tooling. The arrow mark on the top of piston should face the front of engine. Note: don't impact the piston cooling nozzle. Lubricate the piston ring. Adjust the piston ring opening direction so that the openings of adjacent piston rings are placed by 120 degree and not at the piston pin axis. Compress piston ring with piston ring compressor. Install piston and connecting rod assembly. If the piston cannot move freely during installation, remove the piston. Check if it is broken or damaged, and lubricate the connecting rod shell surface and bolts with clean oil. After that, install the connecting rod cover to the original connecting rod according to the mark. Tighten bolts. Technical specifications. Firstly, tighten the bolts to 34 nanometers. Secondly, rotate the bolts by 60 degrees. Check if all the bosses of connecting rod cover face the front of the engine if the crankshaft rotates freely and if the connecting rod clearance is within 0.10 mm to 0.35 mm. Rotate the crankshaft until the dial indicator reading does not change, which means the TDC of piston is reached. On smooth flat surface of cylinder block, set the dial indicator to 0 and measure the piston protrusion. It should be within 0.034 to 0.260 millimeters. Installation of cylinder head. Tools for installation of cylinder head. Oil drip, torque wrench. New cylinder head gasket must be used. Check cylinder head gasket and ensure it is intact and clean. Install cylinder head gasket to the top of engine cylinder block. The dowel pin hole on the gasket should be aligned with annular dowel pin. Installation of cylinder head. Lubricate bolts with clean oil and install them. Pre-tighten the bolts manually and tighten them as shown. Technical specifications. Firstly, tighten the bolts to 60 nanometers. Secondly, clockwise rotate the bolts by 90 degrees. Thirdly, continue rotating clockwise by 90 degrees. Installation of camshaft. Tools for installation of camshaft. Oil drip, torque wrench, dial indicator with magnetic base, bracket, dial indicator. Clean camshaft surface and check if it is oily or scratched. Install camshaft. Note that the camshaft should not be impacted. Do not mount the camshaft into its hole forcibly. Otherwise, the camshaft will be damaged. Thoroughly lubricate camshaft journal and cam with clean oil. Check and mount camshaft thrust plate. Tighten bolts to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Measure the axial clearance of camshaft. It should be within 0.10 to 0.40 millimeters. Installation of driving chain idler. Tools used for installation of driving chain idler. Oil drip, torque wrench. Install the groove thrust washer onto annular dowel pin. Align the groove with the dowel pin hole in the cylinder block. Check and install the idler. Lubricate the idler shaft with clean oil and rotate it until the dowel pin is locked into the cylinder block pin hole. Install the bolts and thrust washer. Tighten bolts to 130 nanometers according to the technical specification. Note the mounting direction of driven sprocket and ensure that the small chamber side faces outwards. Tighten the bolts to 10 nanometers according to the technical specification. Installation of sprocket chamber cover. Tools used for installation of sprocket chamber cover. Sealant. Check if there is any part cracked or worn severely. Install a new sealing ring into the sealing groove. Ensure proper installation. Apply sealant to the sealing ring as shown. Install the sprocket chamber cover and pre-tighten it manually. Don't tighten the sprocket chamber bolts. Installation of driving chain. Tools used for the installation of driving chain. Torque wrench. Install a new friction gasket onto the front end of camshaft. Install the overhead camshaft sprocket together with a driving chain onto the front end of camshaft and driven gear. Install the chain fixing guide and tensioner chain guide. Tighten the screws to 20 nanometers according to the technical specification. At this time, do not tighten the sprocket chamber housing and bolts shown in the figure. Installation of flywheel housing. Tools used for installation of flywheel housing: Loctite torque wrench. Clean the mounting surface of flywheel housing. Check the flywheel housing and ensure it is free of any crack. According to the tracks as shown, apply Loctite 509 evenly on the mounting surface with glue width at 1 to 2 millimeters. The glue line must be continuous without any breakpoint. Note if the assembly is not finished in 5 minutes or if the tightening is not completed in 15 minutes after gluing, remove the Loctite and repeat the gluing again. The well-glued flywheel housing should be mounted onto the rear end face of cylinder block along the guide pin. Pre-tighten bolts manually. Note, during installation, the flywheel housing should not friction with or shake on the cylinder end face so as to protect the coated surface. Tighten bolts in sequence. Technical specifications: 85 nanometers for number 1 to number 7 bolts, and 24 nanometers for number 8 to number 10 bolts. After the flywheel housing is installed, refer to the torque and sequence shown in the figure to tighten the sprocket housing bolts in several steps. Step 1. 3 nanometers for number 1 and number 2 bolts. Step 2. 6 nanometers for number 3 and number 4 bolts. Step 3. 3 nanometers for number 5, number 6, number 7 and number 8 bolts. Step 4. 10 nanometers for number 1 and number 2 bolts. Step 5. 12 nanometers for number 3 and number 4 bolts. Step 6. 10 nanometers for number 5, number 6, number 7 and number 8 bolts. Step 7. 20 nanometers for number 9 bolt. Installation of rear oil seal. Tools used for installation of rear oil seal. Special tools for rear oil seal: rubber hammer. Clean and check oil seal and its mounting hole. Use duct of new oil seal and locate the new seal onto the rear end of crankshaft. Then use special tools and press the seal to the correct depth at a constant speed. Note: don't oil the new oil seal. Installation of flywheel. Tools used for installation of flywheel: torque wrench, crank. Clean and check the flywheel and ensure it is free of any crack. Installation of flywheel: manually pre-tighten the oiled bolts. Fix the flywheel with the crank to prevent it from rotating. Tighten bolts in the heart-shaped way. Technical specifications: firstly, tighten the bolts to 30 nanometers. Secondly, rotate the bolts by 90 degrees. Installation of crankshaft pulley. Tools used for the installation of crankshaft pulley: torque wrench, crank. Check the crankshaft pulley for tooth lost, crack or other defects. Install the crankshaft pulley and plywood onto the crankshaft. Ensure to align the dowel pin correctly. Lubricate the bolts with clean oil and pre-tighten them manually. Tighten the bolts. Technical specifications: firstly, tighten the bolts to 75 nanometers. Secondly, rotate the bolts by 45 degrees. Note: the crankshaft must be fixed with the crank. Check and install the crankshaft position sensor. Technical specification: 8 nanometers. Installation of chain tensioner. Tools used for installation of chain tensioner: torque wrench. Check if there is any part cracked or worn excessively. Install chain tensioner. Tighten bolts step by step in pairs. Torque to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Confirmation of engine timing. Tools used for determining engine timing: torque wrench, crank, timing pin, camshaft timing plate. Use the engine crank to rotate the crankshaft clockwise. Push the timing pin into the crankshaft pulley and the designated hole in the front chamber cover. Lock up the crankshaft. Mount the timing cover to the front end of camshaft. Tighten the timing cover bolts manually. Meanwhile, keep the rear notch of camshaft vertically upward. Confirm the engine timing. Check and install the overhead camshaft signal board. Install the bolts. Technical specifications. Firstly, tighten bolts to 120 nanometers. Secondly, release bolts by 180 degrees. Thirdly, tighten to 30 nanometers. Fourthly, rotate by 45 degrees. Installation of sprocket chamber cover. Tools for installation of sprocket chamber cover: Loctite, torque wrench. Both sides of sprocket chamber housing protruding from the rubber pad should be glued. Check and install sprocket chamber cover. Pre-tighten it manually. Tighten the bolts as shown to 7 nanometers according to technical specification. Check and install camshaft position sensor. Torque to 8 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of rocker. Tools for installation of rocker: oil drip, torque wrench. Check jumper clamp and rocker for any crack or excessive wear. Restore the removed parts according to the marks made during disassembly. Any cracked or worn part should be immediately replaced. If the jumper clamp is replaced with a new one, note that the large head should face the exhaust side. Use clean oil to lubricate the rocker and the contact surface between camshaft and jumper clamp. Restore the rocker assembly. Pre-tighten it manually. Tighten bearing seat bolts to 36 nanometers according to technical specification. Adjustment of valve clearance. Tools for adjustment of valve clearance: feeler gauge 0.02 to 1.00 millimeters, torque wrench, timing pin, hexagon socket wrench, crank. After confirming the engine timing, rotate crankshaft with a crank. Insert the timing pin. When the crankshaft pulley hole aligns with front gear chamber cover hole and both rockers of number 1 cylinder are loosened, it indicates the TDC of number 1 cylinder compression is reached. Note: only when the engine coolant temperature stays at 60 degrees Celsius or below can the valve clearance be adjusted. Intake valve clearance 0.25 plus or minus 0.05 millimeters. Exhaust valve clearance 0.51 plus or minus 0.05 millimeters. At the TDC of number 1 cylinder compression, check or adjust the intake valve clearance of number 1 cylinder. Exhaust valve clearance of number 1 cylinder. Intake valve clearance of number 2 cylinder. Exhaust valve clearance of number 3 cylinder. Turn the crankshaft by 360 degrees with a crank. Adjust the engine to number 4 cylinder compression TDC. Check or adjust the exhaust valve clearance of number 2 cylinder. Intake valve clearance of number 3 cylinder. Intake valve clearance and exhaust valve clearance of number 4 cylinder. Adjusting method: loosen the lock nut and adjusting screw. Insert the feeler gauge. Adjust the adjusting screw and fix it. Tighten the lock nut to 10 nanometers according to the technical specification. Measure the valve clearance again. While the feeler gauge slides between the jumper clamp and camshaft, if you feel some resistance, it means the clearance is correct. Installation of rocker chamber cover. Tools for installation of rocker chamber cover: torque wrench. Clean and check the rocker chamber cover. Check if the sealing strip is clean and intact. Replace any cracked sealing strip. Install the rocker chamber cover and pre-tighten it manually. Tighten bolts in sequence. Torque to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of fuel injector. Tools for installation of fuel injector, torque wrench. If a used injector is to be installed, proper marks should be made during disassembly so as to restore the injector. Check if there is any damaged part of fuel injector. Note that the copper gasket of injector cannot be omitted. It is a must to use a new copper gasket. The inlet cap of injector is not allowed to be removed. Remove the injector nozzle cap. Install injector into the cylinder head with the injector inlet facing the intake side. Tighten injector holder bolts. Technical specifications. Firstly, tighten the bolts to 50 nanometers. Secondly, rotate the bolts by 90 degrees. Installation of injector supply pipe. Tools for installation of injector supply pipe. Torque wrench. If a used fuel supply pipe is to be installed, proper marks should be made during disassembly so as to restore the pipe. Check and install the high-pressure common rail. Tighten it manually. Remove the rails at both ends of the fuel supply pipe as well as the injector outlet joint cap. Install the injector supply pipe and pre-tighten it manually. For the rest 3 pipelines, repeat this process. Tighten the fuel supply pipe nuts at the injector to 27 nanometers according to the technical specification. Tighten the fuel supply pipe nuts at the rail to 27 nanometers according to the technical specification. Note: the joints should be tightened to the specified torque with a torque wrench. The joints, if loosened, may lead to fuel leakage. The joints, if over-tightened, may damage the fuel pipe. Tighten the high-pressure fuel rail bolts to 24 nanometers according to the technical specifications. Installation of intake manifold. Tools for installation of intake manifold. Torque wrench. Install a new intake manifold gasket onto the intake manifold. Note that the side with the part number should face outwards. Install the intake manifold. Tighten the bolts in sequence to 10 nanometers according to the technical specification. Check and mount the intake heater. Note the mounting direction. Torque to 5 nanometers according to the technical specification. Check and install the intake manifold pressure and temperature sensor. Torque to 6 nanometers according to the technical specification. Install the intake elbow and seal onto the intake manifold. Torque to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of air compressor. Tools for installation of air compressor. Torque wrench. Check air compressor housing and drive gear for crack or other defects. Mount air compressor and 3 bolts onto the cylinder block. Tighten bolts to 33 nanometers according to technical specification. Mount the air compressor bracket and tighten its 5 bolts manually. Tighten bolts in sequence to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Mount the trapezoidal joint onto the oil filter seat and pre-tighten it manually. Find the right angle according to the mark and tighten the joint onto the oil pump to 22 nanometers according to the technical specification. Mount the air compressor oil supply pipe onto the air compressor and oil pump connector. Screw 2 hollow pipe fittings, 1 and 2, onto the air compressor. Torque to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Screw the pipe fitting onto the trapezoidal joint 3 and torque it to 18 nanometers according to technical specification. Mount and tighten the trapezoidal screw to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Install coolant pipe. Installation of fuel pump. Tools for installation of fuel pump. Torque wrench. Check and mount fuel pump assembly. The convex side of fuel pump should be completely fitted into the concave of compressor. Mount and tighten the bolts to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Note: it is unnecessary to calibrate the timing of high-pressure fuel pump and crankshaft. Installation of thermostat. Tools for installation of thermostat. Torque wrench. Check thermostat for any notch or other defects. Mount it onto cylinder head and tighten its bolts to 23 nanometers according to technical specification. Note: without thermostat, it is prohibited to run the engine. Otherwise, the engine will be overheated. Check and install coolant bypass pipe. O-ring must be replaced. Install and tighten fixing bolts to 7 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of lug. Tools for installation of lug. Torque wrench. Mount front and rear lugs of engine. Torque to 33 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of fuel rail supply pipe. Tools for installation of fuel rail supply pipe. Torque wrench. Mount new gasket onto intake manifold. Clean and check high pressure supply pipe. Remove protective cap. Mount fuel supply pipe onto fuel pump and fuel rail. Pre-tighten manually. Tighten bolts at the fuel pump and rail to 27 nanometers according to technical specification. Tighten fixing screws at the intake manifold to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of coolant inlet pipe joint. Tools for installation of coolant inlet pipe joint. Torque wrench. Install a new O-ring into the coolant inlet pipe joint. Mount the inlet joint and bolts. Tighten bolts to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of oil sump. Tools for installation of oil sump. Oil drip, torque wrench, sealant. Clean and check oil sump mounting interface. The T-joint shown in the figure should be coated with a thin layer of sealant. Note: if the assembly is not finished in 5 minutes, or if the tightening is not completed in 15 minutes after gluing, remove the sealant and repeat the gluing again. Check and mount the oil sump. Note its mounting direction. Tighten screws as shown to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Lubricate and check threads and sealing surface of drain plug. The O-ring, if damaged, should be replaced. Tighten oil drain plug to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Avoid over-tightening. Install oil dipstick. Installation of oil filter. Tools for installation of oil filter. Oil drip, torque wrench. Lubricate main gasket 1 and O-ring 2 with clean oil. Ensure auxiliary gasket 3 is clean and dry. Don't lubricate. Pre-fill clean oil into the filter. Mount the filter onto its base and tighten it manually until the auxiliary gasket contacts the filter surface. Tighten the filter bottom with a 1/2 inch wrench to 40 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of fuel return pipe. Remove fuel rail and pump protective cap. Mount fuel return pipe joint onto high pressure fuel rail. Mount fuel return pipe joint onto high pressure fuel pump. Mount fuel return pipe joint onto injector respectively. According to the pipeline layout method recorded during this assembly, fix the fuel return pipe properly and ensure it is not twisted or bent. Installation of exhaust manifold. Tools used for installation of exhaust manifold. Torque wrench. Mount the new gasket onto the exhaust manifold. No positive and negative sides are distinguished for this gasket, namely, it is available on both sides. Mount exhaust manifold onto cylinder head. Tighten the manifold from its center to the outside to 40 nanometers according to technical specification. Note: to retighten all bolts, install heat shield and tighten bolts to 10 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of turbocharger. Tools used for installation of turbocharger. Torque wrench. The O-ring of fuel return pipe should be coated with a thin layer of oil. Push fuel return pipe into its boss. Ensure the two O-rings completely sit in the hole. Install new gasket and turbocharger. Install and tighten 3 mounting nuts and 1 screw to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Install oil supply pipe onto front gear cover 1 and turbocharger bearing seat 2. New copper gasket must be used. The oil supply pipe joint of turbocharger should be filled with clean oil for pre-injection. Tighten oil supply pipe to final torque. Torque to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Tighten fixing screws to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Install turbocharger and its outlet joint. Torque to 24 nanometers according to technical specification. Install turbocharger compressor, outlet joint and new O-ring. Installation of accessories. Tools used for installation of accessories. Torque wrench. Check and install and starter. Torque to 43 nanometers according to technical specification. Check and install the fan hub. Tighten bolts diagonally to 43 nanometers according to technical specification. Check and install accessory bracket. Torque to 65 nanometers according to technical specification. Check and install belt tension pulley. Torque to 43 nanometers according to technical specification. Check and install 2 idler pulleys. Torque to 43 nanometers according to technical specification. Check and install the fan pulley. Tighten bolts diagonally to 43 nanometers according to technical specification. Check and install the generator. Torque to 46 nanometers according to technical specification. Installation of harnesses. Mount engine harness. Mount fuel injector harness connector. Mount the camshaft position sensor harness connector. Mount oil pressure sensor connector. Mount intake manifold temperature and pressure sensor connector. Mount rail pressure sensor harness connector. Mount coolant temperature sensor harness connector. Mount crankshaft speed sensor harness connector. Mount engine control module. Note: ensure that no harness is interfered with other components. All harness connectors should be secure. Inspection. After assembly, check if each system of engine is not installed or mounted incorrectly. Check if fuel system pipeline is connected reliably. Check if any harness connector is connected falsely. If the ECM is replaced, calibrated,